That's
okay,
better.
so excellent. Thank you everyone for coming. Thank you very much. It gives me immense pleasure to introduce Oscar Guardiola-Rivera. As you've heard, he's the author of Story of a Death Foretold. Now, if I can begin with a little personal anecdote, I think my very first political memory, when I must have been 8 or maybe 10 years old, concerned Chile and Henry Kissinger. And it was a remark which I certainly can't quote verbatim, but I think capture the spirit. It was a throwaway remark that Henry Kissinger made, which was, if a country in our neighborhood should be so irresponsible as to elect a communist, the United States cannot be held responsible for its actions. And this taught the young me a couple of lessons. I probably shouldn't use the language that first sprang into my mind, but I remember being struck by the cynicism behind that remark. But also, it's the moment when Chile first entered my mind. I think I was far from alone from that. This coup in 1973 had an enormous impact, far beyond what one might have expected. It resonated with a great many people around the world, and at the time, and for many years after, I think many people outside Latin America were tempted to view it in terms of Cold War politics. It made an obvious, almost a parable, if you like, of the conflict and how the United States was prepared to intervene when necessary. But it's become clear, and as Oscar tells brilliantly in his book, it's become clear that the conflict also was at once symbol and emblem and focal point of a great many other fissures and conflicts in society. Oscar, can you tell, in societies around the world, not just Chile, but in many developing countries in Africa, Latin America, and beyond. Oscar, can you tell us a little bit about your book?
Well, I'm the author of a previous book, cheekily titled "What If Latin America Ruled the World?" Very humble title. The answer to which is very simple: we would all dance better. And I had to find a way to continue with that subject. I'm very interested in the way in which certain very local stories which at first seem very specific, very localized, become, as you pointed out, Jack, emblems and symbols of the world we live in. And I was reminded 3 or 4 years ago of a day in my home country, in Colombia. I was very young when Gabriel Garcia Marquez, our most cherished writer, received the Nobel Prize for Literature. This was 1982. I must have been 11 or 12. Mm-hmm. And we would all gather around the radio to listen to Garcia Marquez's acceptance speech. And the whole speech revolved around a figure which he presented in his usual beautiful use of language. Mm-hmm. He spoke of a Promethean president who died in his burning palace fighting an entire army alone. That phrase got stuck in my mind, and he never mentions the name of the character. Years later, I came across the name of Salvador Allende, the president of Chile in the 1970s to whom Garcia Marquez referred. And it was a big surprise for me because I had thought all those years that Garcia Marquez was just referring to a fictional story. I learned then that it wasn't, not only that it wasn't fictional, but also that it was a crucial moment for Latin American writers in general and for literature in the Americas. I don't know if you know this, but led by Garcia Marquez and the Argentinian writer Julio Cortázar, most Latin American writers after 1973 stopped writing fiction. And they began to write only non-fiction, at least for a decade. This was their way of responding to what had happened on the 11th of September 1973. And so my first reaction was to see if I could do what they didn't do, which is to fictionalize this story. So at first I wrote what could be called a historical novel. But then I became conscious of the fact that this particular event in history could not be treated as a novel because it was in fact a classical tragedy. A classical tragedy in the stricter sense of the term. It was a Greek tragedy. As you all know, in Greek tragedies, somebody announces a catastrophe that is going to occur, hence the title, Story of a Death Foretold. Somebody announces it in order to avert it, and yet, in the very act of announcing it, the person who does so brings it about. And this is exactly what happened in Chile. Everyone knew what was going to happen. Everybody was certain that it would happen, and everybody did what they could to avert it, but in doing so, made it happen. And so I tell the story as a tragedy, as a Greek tragedy. We have two main characters which evolve together throughout a narrative arc which begins with the incremental violence that presided over and after the liquidation of the Cold War world order and ends with the period where we find ourselves now. A period that Chileans call transition, but which they conceive of as a sort of stasis, as a period in which nothing happens, which is very paradoxical, of course, because the very notion, the very idea of transition entails the idea that we will go from somewhere to somewhere else, from dictatorship to democracy, for instance. But for Chileans nowadays, their transition led nowhere. And so they conceive of their time as a time of limbo, as a space in which nothing happens, a sort of purgatory. So I wanted to tell the story of how the violence that was unleashed during the Cold War resulted in the world in which we all live nowadays, a world in which history has more or less stopped, a world in which new ideas and the creativity that characterized the period of the 1970s and 1960s is no more, a period in which big ideas and big dreams have pretty much been forbidden. And I wanted to recover that spirit, the spirit of creativity, the spirit of passion, the spirit of a struggle that characterized people like Allende and those who struggled in Chile in the 1970s.
If I can, at the risk of putting this notion under a little strain, if I can prod you on this idea you suggested of a tragedy. I mean, one of the what gives a tragic drama so much of its force, of course, is, as you say, the spectacle of the inevitable unfolding and decisions made incorrectly or paths not taken. Are you suggesting that the coup was always inevitable? Were there not alternative futures that Chile could have perhaps explored?
The coup was not inevitable. There is nothing inevitable in history. History is, sum of contingent occurrences, but it was designed. It is important to acknowledge, for instance, and now we have enough documentation, enough evidence to back up this acknowledgement, that before Salvador Allende had the chance to manage well and or mismanage the economy, before he was confirmed as president of Chile, the decision to oust him had already been taken in the back corridors of Washington by two groups of peoples. On the one hand, some members of the Chilean elite whose motivations were not purely pragmatical. They were motivated by a sense of entitlement. They always thought of themselves as the sole owners of Chile, as one of them, Eduardo Mate, put it. And they conceived of the rest of the people as of no importance. These are his exact words. And on the other hand, the Nixon administration, led mainly by, well, both Nixon and Henry Kissinger. And here again, what we have is a conflict of world views. Together with the magnificent quote that you just gave us, there is another one which provides the perfect context and backdrop for the story that is going to unfold. In 1969, that is to say, before Salvador Allende was elected president of Chile, Henry Kissinger told the then Chilean ambassador in Washington that history had never happened and would never happen in the South. According to Kissinger, and this is his philosophy of history, if you like, history began in Beijing. It would then go to Moscow, pass through Europe, and end in Washington. And that was it. So if you imagine the world as a circle, as a circumference, what Kissinger was doing was dividing that circumference into two halves. And if you move it a little bit, you have the line of the horizon, and at the top you have the north, at the bottom you have the south. And according to him, history could only happen in the north, not in the south. And so the very idea of having a leader such as Allende or others around the world, including the Indian subcontinent and Africa, trying to make history, that very idea was received with tremendous hostility. The world order, as they saw it, was precisely a world in which the countries of the North and the peoples of the North gave history its orientation, and in the South, well, the South was either too cold or or more often too hot. And as you know very well, you know the stereotype. Oh, it's too hot. When it is too hot, you tend to lay back. You become lazy. You're a spendthrift. You don't do much. The peoples of the South can never govern themselves. So let us. It is us who can do so. And it is that worldview which coincides with the worldview of the Chilean elites, who saw themselves as also the makers of history. And so the story I wanted to tell is the story of how those peoples, those who have been kind of dismissed as agents of history, actually become the agents of their own story. And in doing so, they change the world entirely. This world, which was then divided into two, that is the image of the Cold War, in fact, two warring factions, suddenly became something very complicated, very different, something that actually the Nixon administration and Kissinger could not digest. In fact, and this is a very little known it is a very little known fact that at some point in between the 1970 and 1972, Salvador Allende became, in the eyes of the US administration, much more dangerous than Fidel Castro himself. And the reason is a very interesting one. In the eyes of the Nixon administration, and Henry Kissinger in particular, Salvador Allende was much more dangerous because, unlike Fidel Castro, he didn't wear green fatigues, he didn't have a beard, he was not for armed struggle.
He won an election.
Exactly, he won an election. He was both a Marxist and an avowed Democrat. He was a man struggling for the people, but at the same time, someone who would wear really nice clothes, drink good wine, enjoy his womanizing, and so on and so forth. So he was neither cook nor raw. And that that in-betweenness is precisely what the Nixon administration couldn't muster. And so this figure became a sort of definition of evil, something that you cannot locate in the coordinates of your imaginary world. In exploding the preconceptions of the Cold War, the Chilean story, the story of the Chilean Revolution, became also a blueprint for other possible worlds. And it is that legacy which has been rescued in Latin America nowadays.
So on some level, it's almost a personal conflict. And Kissinger has this deep... But before perhaps you respond to that, can you tell people who may be unfamiliar with the specifics of the case, what exactly, about the actions of the United States to undermine Allende, and in particular, what have we learnt in recent years? I gather there's been a certain amount of declassification, and new documents have come out which have shed a great deal of light on American actions.
There are three things which we have learned thanks to recently declassified documents, which are of importance and relevance to us now. The first one is that way before, as I pointed out already, way before the leftist party led by Salvador Allende had a chance to mismanage the economy. This is often the accusation that is made against the Allende government, and the sort of justification for the coup. Before he had the opportunity to do so, the choice, the decision to oust him by violent means had already been made. Not only that, the documents also reveal that the United States, the administration of the time, did not want the Allende government to be replaced by a liberal democracy. Not. What they wanted was a military dictatorship along the lines of the Brazilian dictatorship of the time. So that's a very important fact, because
Just to be clear, these decisions made in Washington.
It was made in Washington way before Allende had any chance to govern or mismanage government and law. That's the first lesson. The second lesson is the way in which the United States went about intervening in Latin America. Kissinger was very clear. He did not want others to find out about Washington's involvement. So it is as if they wanted their fingers everywhere, but their fingerprints nowhere. Which is why they developed a foreign policy at the time which revolved around the use of other governments, in this particular case the Brazilian dictatorship, to do their bid. So it was a war by proxy, in a sense. And also the main aim was always to make sure that their activities would be kept secret. This is very important because this very characteristic of US foreign policy survives to this day. To this day, the US prefers secret operations. It prefers to operate in the shadows, which is why we have had the recent revelations through Edward Snowden and through WikiLeaks and others, and the kind of response that the US government has given to such revelations. Still, the idea for them is to have their fingers everywhere, but for the rest of us not to know it. And the third and final lesson is the following. When people organize themselves politically, they can actually bring about important changes. Changes of such importance that they would decisively change the balance of power in the world. And this is precisely what the Chileans did. And it is very important because, in principle, Chile is a peripheral nation. It is far away in the southern cone of Latin America. Henry Kissinger himself once said that Chile was like a dagger pointed at the heart of Antarctica. Very strange thing to say. But something that reveals the way in which distance and proximity were already changing in the 1970s, which gives us the world that we have today, a world in which the old divisions between North and South, East and West are collapsing. A world in which what happens in India, in China, in Brazil may be as or more important than what happens in Washington and or in London. And it is in that respect, for good and ill, that the story of Chile, as Gabriel Garcia Marquez put it at the time, although it happened in Chile, in this faraway country, to the chagrin of Chileans, it is relevant to us all.
I'm intrigued by the character of Allende, because he was clearly an immensely cultured man and an immensely intelligent man. He knew what he was up against in Chile, and he knew what the United States was capable of. He'd seen, I'm thinking in particular of the intervention in Guatemala, the Arbenz coup, sort of 20 years earlier, and he was seeing every day the United States and its intervention in Vietnam, which was obviously ongoing at the time. Surely he knew that he was heading for trouble. Have I lost my... Is that better? Do I have to talk down like this? But surely, my question is, is that better? Okay, I'll try and hold it like this. So surely, my question is, surely Allende knew what was coming. He knew, or if not, why not? I mean, why was he so optimistic? Was he a quixotic figure?
He wasn't an optimist in the sense of a romantic figure or a naive figure. He knew what was going to happen, but, and this is what I really like about not only him, but other characters around him, which can be as or more interesting than him. His daughter, for instance, Beatriz Allende, a congresswoman called Carmen Lazo, and a number of people active at the time. They knew what was going to happen, but they didn't care. They didn't fear.
He knew he was going to die?
He knew it. He knew it.
When he became president, or?
Well, you asked before, what kinds of actions the U.S. took. We know for a fact that right after Allende had been elected, but before he had been confirmed, the United States Secret Service got together with some very unsavory characters in Chile, a group of far right-wing, ultra-Catholic, Francoist fanatics, a group that called itself Fatherland and Freedom. I mean, what a name. And together they conspired to provoke an event that would result in stopping Congress from confirming Allende as president. That conspiracy resulted in the assassination of the then commander of the Chilean armed forces. So that's the extent to which they were ready to go. So at the time, after the assassination of this General Schneider, that was his name, Allende made a public speech in which he declared that, of course, General Schneider was not the target. He was the target. So from the very outset, he knew that his life was at stake. And yet, it seems to me, and this goes to illuminate a point that you already made, the personalities, the personal characteristics of these peoples matter most. Because I do believe that for Allende and others at the time, death did not mean the collapse of everything. They were not martyrs. He said so many times. He He never thought of himself as a martyr. He loved life to the fullest. I mean, this is a man who really drank his wine. He loved his wine. He had many lovers. I mean, actually, the very Sunday before the coup, he's spending the last morning with the last of a very long line of lovers. He is in love with life. So it wasn't a case of people who were ready to give their life for a cause. It wasn't like that. For them, death had a very different meaning. And he makes it very clear in the conversation he has with his daughter on the 11th of September of 1973. This is his last conversation with his daughter. It's a beautiful conversation, and it's one of the parts of the book that I enjoy the most writing. I cried. I was crying while writing it because Beatriz Allende, his daughter, gave a very precise rendition of the conversation, and she reminds us that it is said that at the moment of death, everything goes quiet. Everything stops. It is as if time itself had stopped. And then you're able to look at your actions in the past and the long future. And this is precisely, according to the narrative we have of that conversation, this is precisely what happened at the moment of his death. He was able to look at the past. He was able to recognize mistakes, but he was able also to recognize the tremendous strength of the people. Rather than him as a leader, he was much more ready to acknowledge what the people had done. And because of that, he looked forward into the future, and his final message, which was recorded, and his words survive, you can find them anywhere on the internet, were precisely that in the future, after the violence that was about to be unleashed, people would be ready to recover that spirit. And the most beautiful element of this story, and this is where my book ends, is the way in which the current generation of young Chileans, people who were born way after the coup had happened, went back and recovered that legacy. And it is very interesting to see the way in which they did so, because the main aim of the coup, and this is the aim of any kind of violence of this scale, was to wipe out any memory, any trace, any evidence that could in the future inspire others to try and do something similar. That was the idea. But then in 2011, you find these very young Chileans discovering the story that their parents never told them. Their parents never told them the story for many reasons. Some because of fear, others because they had rejected that past, others because they wanted to protect their sons and daughters, and they didn't tell them the story, thinking that that would protect them from making the same, inverted commas, mistakes. And yet they found the words of Allende on the internet, they found the images. This is one of the most visually documented events in history. There's a magnificent film by a documentary maker named Patricio Guzman. He filmed pretty much the entire coup as it happened. It's absolutely harrowing. There is a scene in which a cameraman films his own death. A soldier shoots him, and you can see the camera falling. And the youth of Chile, the current youth of Chile, recovered that spirit. And that's the spirit, I believe, of the kind of optimism that we need now. Because we live in a world in which rather than history occurring, rather than history happen, we could perhaps best describe our situation as, history stumbling from crisis to crisis, from one catastrophe to another, from the 2008 crisis to the next one, which is already being announced. But these young Chileans are refusing to live that kind of life. They led the 2011 student movement, which called for the renationalization of copper. It called for education to be free for all. In the last elections, late last year, many of the leaders of the former student movement were elected to Congress. And so you see a tremendous change happening in Chile against the odds. And that to me is the final lesson and the most interesting lesson of this story. And hopefully you'll find it interesting as well when you read the book. The lesson being that no matter how much violence is unleashed in order to stop us from dreaming, in order to stop us from becoming the agents of our own history, we will find a way.
In the first third of your book, I mean, in keeping with this tragic notion, you paint a picture of the sort of fatal flaw, if you like, sort of present from the beginning. You begin the book, if I recall correctly, with Lord Cochrane, and this nexus of business and force has been there from the start. But in your last remarks, are you suggesting that this has been weakened as a result of Allende?
It has been weakened because it is absolutely clear that as crisis piles up upon crisis, the system is realizing that it requires more and more violence in order to keep up the kinds of benefits that the few receive. We live in a world in which we can no longer distinguish between human history as such and the history of nature, the history of the world, if only because through the same technologies that made us free, the same processes that gave us control over nature, we have now become, as the Indian historian Dipesh Chakrabarty puts it, geological agents. So now we can even impact geological time, climate change, for instance, something that was already clear in the 1970s in the case of atomic energy. We now have the capacity to not only destroy each other, but in fact to destroy the entire world. And when this when we realize that this is the case, we need to ask ourselves not only about the moral limits of freedom and or markets, but also the ecological limits of markets, and if you like, the cosmological limits of markets. What happened in Chile after 1973 was the subjection of every single aspect of society, from education to the care of the elder, to the interest of financial marketization. And the result has been, first in Chile, but we recognize the same result everywhere else in the world, the widening of the gap between those who have and those who have not. And the widening of that gap is not only a fact of political importance, but it is now also part and parcel of the very process which is pushing the limits of our environment and nature to the brink of destruction. And if that is the case, then we need to ask ourselves, we need to ask ourselves what can be done, and what can be done is to initiate a conversation between ourselves and nature in order to establish what can be subjected or submitted to the logic of markets and what should never be subjected to the logic of markets. And that precise and very relevant question is the question that the current youth of Chile is posing, and I think that question is relevant to us all.
One actor we haven't mentioned, but who's a very big presence in in the background sometimes, but sometimes intervening very directly in events, is the church. Can you give a little summary of the role of the Catholic Church in 1973, and following on from that, perhaps, how has that changed over the course of the last 40 years?
The role of religion in general and Catholic religion in this specific case is ambiguous. On the one hand, you have some very progressive accounts of religiosity, what we in Latin America call popular religiosity. The way in which the people relate to the story of the Exodus, for instance, as a story of liberation. That was a very important force in a very important force motivating the grassroots of the Chilean population to open up the avenues for change that then were led by Allende and others. But at the same time, you have another side of religiosity, the one that motivated those, in particular those civilians who were behind the coup in Chile. And it is the case, we can also document that fact, that those Chileans did not need to wait for the United States to manipulate them into designing the coup. They were from the very outset convinced that in trying to find a limit to the so-called freedoms of entrepreneurship, the freedoms of profit making, the government of Allende and the social movements that were the support, the very blood and soul of the Allende movement, were in fact attempting against some God-given liberties. And because of that, they concluded, these young conservatives concluded at the time that it would be justifiable, as it had been in Spain during the time of Francisco Franco, to oust that government by any means necessary. And it is because of that reasoning that the kind of violence that was unleashed upon the people of Chile was of such intensity and fury. In the second part of the book, I liken what happened in Chile in the 1970s to the tragedy of Orestes, the Greek tragedy of the Furies, as rewritten by Jean-Paul Sartre in the 1940s. It is as if the Furies had descended upon the cities of Chile, grabbed hold of the soul of some of its members, and those convinced that they were defending revealed truths concluded that they needed to subject Chilean society to a sort of exorcism, a trial by fire. And this is exactly what happened. And you see here a very interesting and very dangerous link between dogmatism, in this case religious dogmatism, and what after 1973 would become a form of economic dogmatism, what we now call, and this is a term that I don't particularly like, neoliberalism. In Chile, neoliberalism did not emerge solely because of the influence of the Chicago School. It also had another motivation, and that motivation is a sort of theology of hatred that was present in Spain, that was very racist in nature, and that one should call by its real name. It was a kind of fascism, one that dismisses other people as unimportant in the name of a revealed truth. And that is the way in which the role of religion in Chile was so ambiguous. On the one hand, progressive, on the other hand, very regressive.
I have the unhappy duty of announcing that time is running short, but we have some time for some questions. If anyone would like, we can do our best to see you through the glare. And if you stand up with the microphone, Oscar will be happy to respond.
Thank you. You obviously love your Gabriel Garcia. Uh, let me, the USA cynicism, the Kissinger's point about the North, or the point about the foolish country votes is at its own cost, of course goes back to the Monroe Doctrine. But had the US, like in Cuba with Fidel Castro or with Allende, actually tried to engage, after all, let's remember, Allende came to power with 36% of the votes. 64% of Chile voted against Allende when he came to power. Could the US say, and unlikely because same time we had Bangladesh where Kissinger was happy to see hundreds of thousands of people die, 10 million sent to exile. So this US cynicism apart, supposing there was a different attitude, could the USA not have engaged in that sense with Allende and avoided the inevitability of the coup that Mr. Shakespeare talked about? And on Allende's side, seeing that the limited coalition behind him, could he not be less revolutionary in trying to reshape the economy, the nationalization of bus transport, etc., etc.? Between these two, could the history, it's always a what if, could history have been different?
We must remember that when examining the role of the United States at the time, there is no need to slip into any dogmatic anti-Americanism. I mean, we must remember that the US Nixon administration was as unpopular in the United States as it was elsewhere. And many of the things that the US administration did in Latin America, it was also doing so, it was also applying them against its own citizens, the COINTELPRO operation, for instance. So that first clarification, this is something to do with the interest of a particular administration that was clearly hijacked by big economic interests. It is important to know that the main instigator of the coup in Chile was a Chilean named Agustin Edwards, the inheritor of a very powerful family whose roots go back to the 19th century, a banking family, who was a very good friend of the then president of Pepsi Cola, who had given Richard Nixon his first big account as a lawyer. And it is through that connection that the decision to oust Allende was taken. And that is something that is not too unfamiliar to us nowadays. We also know for a fact that many of our democracies suffer from the excessive influence of big economic interests. What would have happened if the US had a different attitude? That answer can be given for certain. What would have happened was what Allende was about to announce on the very week in which the coup d'etat took place. He was going to announce a plebiscite. He was going to allow the Chilean citizens to decide whether or not he should continue as a president, which is to say, and that, you know, and there is no denying problems. There were economic problems. There were many decisions were flawed, and so on. If that was the case, then what Allende was going to propose to the Chilean people was to allow the democratic process to take its course and to decide whether he should stay or not. And he publicly said that he was ready to step down if the Chileans voted him to go. But that was an outcome that not only had been examined by the US administration at the time, but had been rejected by the US administration. Because, and this is another very interesting fact in this story, the US not only feared, not only feared the fact that this was a leftist government. What it feared the most was the possibility of a leftist government not doing well, and then democracy taking its course and voting him out, which would have meant that actually democracy and communism were not incompatible. They could have, democracy could actually deal with even a flawed leftist government. But at the time, that was anathema, because in the conception of the Cold War, particularly in the eyes of the Nixon administration, communism was the very opposite of democracy. And to allow a country, for instance Chile, to prove otherwise would have been a tremendous blow. There are documents in which Kissinger is arguing the case. It is also the case that the Chilean government became the spokesperson of a different voice in the world, a world that could not be defined as, according to the old coordinates of the Cold War, the voice of the third world, the non-aligned movement. Allende gave a very important speech in the United Nations, a speech that he had designed together with Indira Gandhi, among others, which called for the overhaul of the international economic system and international institutions. One big question that remains unanswered that I would love to be able to answer is what would have happened with that voice if many of those leaders, because it wasn't Allende alone, as you pointed out, if many of those leaders had not been either ousted or killed at the time. I'm absolutely positive that we would have had a very different global economic institutionality, one that perhaps would not have resulted in the sorts of crises that we keep going through.
Do we have time for another question? Yes?
There's another one there.
Yeah, hi. I was a kid at the time and living in the U.S. and I remember reading about the events in Chile, especially in relation to how well documented the coup was and brutal and all that. Who and where were Chile's friends at the time?
Chile's friends? You mean Allende's allies? Not many. Not many. Cuba was a friend. The Cuban presence in Chile was important. It was not decisive, but it was important. Allende's daughter Beatriz was married to a well-known Cuban agent, and she had been part of Che's guerrilla in Bolivia. Her and her father had very different views about the means through which socialism should find its course, and that relationship between them is also one of the most interesting stories in the book. So Cuba was a friend, as well as many of the countries of the Third World. But what is most important is that some that we could expect to be friendly, in fact, were not, particularly the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was totally uninterested about what was happening in Chile. We know that Allende, at a time of tremendous economic strife, Allende actually traveled to Moscow and had a meeting in the Kremlin and acknowledged that the meeting had been a complete failure. He acknowledged something that Ernesto Guevara had already acknowledged for the Cuban case, that the Soviets had put in place a model that was flawed, that would not be sustainable, and also one in which they were much less interested in allowing other countries to find their own way and much more interested in imposing their own way. It is also the case that at the time, the Nixon administration was engaged in a process of détente. It was engaged in a process of cooling down hostilities with China, and Moscow wanted in. Moscow was, Russia was already in big economic trouble. And so they also stepped back, and they never intervened. In fact, what this goes to show is that the world of the Cold War was much less simple than we would like to think. It wasn't just a battle between two foes, East and West. The emergence of the so-called Third World provided different alternatives that were not received with optimism by either side. And that is a very interesting fact that may perhaps allow us to rethink the story of the Cold War. It wasn't just about two tribes going to war. There were other views, there were other ways of conceiving of further freedom and further creativity, which defied the strictures of both leftist dogmatism and right-wing dogmatism.
Hello. I was in Chile a few months ago and I went to the museum in Santiago that tells the story of the coup, and it's a marvellous place. And there was a map in one of the displays that showed the clusters, the length of the country, where people were assassinated or disappeared. And I was reflecting on what you said earlier about the future for the country and how people think about the coup and what ensued these days. And I was wondering if you would reflect on the missing and the disappeared and that sort of followed the coup.
The impact of the disappeared was perhaps stronger on the long-term memory of Chileans than all the other atrocities combined. Disappearance is a very vicious form of violence because it attacks not only, it entails not only the disappearance of the political enemy, the erasure of the political enemy, but it instills something, an emptiness in the souls of those who are left behind. There is a group of women in Chile who, to this day, travel to the Atacama Desert in the north, and they, at the time I interviewed two of them, one of them was 74, the other one was 76, and they were still going through the desert. Imagine the vastness of this desert. I mean, this is the driest desert on planet Earth, and they were still going, quarter by quarter. They had divided the desert into quarters, looking for bones, trying to find those that they had lost. And the feeling you get when you talk to them is a feeling of complete emptiness. It is as if every single emotion, anything that would motivate you to fight, to struggle, had been taken away from them. And yet, and this is again another beautiful realization in the middle of such a catastrophe, they develop a certain relationship with these specters, because that's what they become, in fact, specters. They do not cease to exist, at least not for them. There are many in Chile who accuse these women of being, stuck in the past, old ladies trying to, being unable to forget and forgive and so on. But what you have to understand is that for them, perhaps because the bodies were never recovered, their sons and daughters who disappeared remain in existence. And that, I was very impressed by the way in which that kind of relationship mapped very beautifully, could be juxtaposed with the belief of the indigenous peoples of the South, the Mapuche, about the relationship with the ancestors. And there is a whole other relationship, a whole other world emerging, which is also a political world, which has to do precisely with the relationship between those of us who were left here and those who remain in purgatory. In a sense, the entirety of Chilean society now sees itself in the mirror of the disappeared. When they speak of transition, and I'm thinking particularly of the youth of Chile, when they speak of transition, they do not see it as a happy moment in which dictatorship ends and democracy returns. Rather, they see it as precisely existing in limbo, as if history never moved, as if they continued in disappearance. And so, perhaps of all the atrocities that were committed during the dictatorship, this is the one that became more significant. One ritual sums it up. Many of the wives of those who disappeared began to dance a very important folk dance among Chileans, one that has its roots in indigenous consciousness, the cueca. And they began to dance it alone. And if you remember what I said about what if Latin America ruled the world, you would understand the importance of dancing alone. For us Latin Americans, the very idea of dancing alone makes no sense whatsoever. Because dancing is a form of language, it's a form of relation, it goes beyond words, it's a form of mutual seduction. You're knowing each other through the language of your body. And it is the most beautiful thing one could learn as a young man or a woman. And so to dance alone means precisely to express the way that the fact that the world has crumbled. Because the world is precisely that relationship, that loving relationship between two or many that come together. So what they express in mirroring disappearance is precisely the fact that togetherness, that relationship, love, became impossible. And this is what they, this is the way in which they denounce not only the situation in Chile, but everywhere else. In a sense, we do live in a world in which love is has become either impossible or unnecessary, because we can just pay, and when you pay the other, you don't really need to know the other, you don't really need to engage the other, and that has a very deleterious, a very ominous, a very a really undesirable impact on society. It breaks up the fabric of society. And it is through this reflection on their very emotions vis-a-vis the fact of the disappearance that first these women and thereafter their sons, their grandsons and granddaughters have been able to rationalize the world in which they live in.
Oscar, I'm really sorry to say this, but I'm afraid we have no more time. I'm sure I speak for everyone in saying that even if you thought you had a very slight interest in this remote and obscure country, this dagger pointed at the heart of Antarctica, I'm sure you've all learnt today that this is a story that concerns a great deal more than just Chile, and that through reading it, your eyes will be open to many, many larger and profoundly moving stories. So please join with me in thanking Oscar Guardiola-Rivera.
Thank you.
Just to thank Oscar Rivera and Jack Turner.